That necklace was buried with my son. Victoria Ashford's voice cut through the rain so sharply that the man beneath the subway awning looked up before he understood she was speaking to him. Isaiah Reed stood beside his 9-year-old daughter, one hand holding his coat around her narrow shoulders while the other rested near the silver compass that had slipped outside his shirt. Traffic hissed across the wet avenue. A Blacktown car waited at the curb with its rear door open, and 2 security men stood several feet behind Victoria, watching Isaiah as though the question had already made him guilty. She had left Ethan's memorial less than 10 minutes earlier. For 2 hours, she had stood beneath a towering photograph of her only son while executives, doctors, and city officials praised the life he had lived before dying exactly 10 years ago. Now she was staring at the one object she had been told was sealed inside his casket. She knew every detail of that necklace. She had commissioned it for Ethan's 18th birthday. She knew the narrow scratch along the lower edge, made when he dropped it on the stone steps of their summer home. No public photograph showed that mark. No copy could have reproduced it by accident. "Where did you get it?" she asked. Isaiah glanced down at the compass, then gently pulled his coat higher around his daughter. "Dad," Grace whispered. "It is all right," he said, though his eyes remained on Victoria. She stepped closer. His boots were worn. His backpack had been repaired with dark thread. Exhaustion had settled deeply into his face. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man the city had stopped seeing. Yet he did not lower his gaze, apologize, or rush to explain himself. That calm, unsettled Victoria more than fear would have. "I asked where you got my son's necklace." One of the guards moved forward, but Victoria raised a hand. Isaiah's fingers closed around the compass. "Your son gave it to me." Her expression hardened. "My son died 10 years ago." "I know." "That necklace was placed with him before the funeral." Isaiah studied her face for a long moment, and something shifted in his eyes. It was not guilt. It was the recognition of a lie he had expected to surface someday. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Your son was still wearing it when I found him alive." The noise of the street seemed to disappear. Victoria stared at him. The official report said Ethan had died on impact. Charles Whitaker had repeated it so many times that the words had become part of the architecture of her grief. No final message. No witness. Nothing left unsaid. "Who are you?" she demanded. Before Isaiah could answer, Grace's backpack slipped from her shoulder. A folded sheet of paper slid onto the wet sidewalk and opened near Victoria's shoes. It was a child's drawing in blue and yellow crayon. Isaiah stood beside Grace, the silver compass around his neck. Behind them was a smiling blonde man holding a baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. Across the top, Grace had written, "The night Dad brought me home." Victoria looked from the picture to the child, then back to Isaiah. Even through a child's uneven lines, she recognized Ethan. "Call the police," she said. Isaiah did not run. He placed one steady hand over Grace's trembling fingers and looked at Victoria with the quiet sorrow of a man who had carried her answer for 10 years. "Before you do that," he said, "you should ask why someone needed you to believe your son died alone." Hours before Victoria Ashford saw the silver compass beneath the subway awning, Isaiah Reed had awakened before sunrise in a room that was not truly theirs. The family shelter called it Unit 12, though it was barely large enough for 2 narrow beds, a metal dresser, and a small window facing the brick wall of the building next door. Grace was still asleep beneath a faded blue blanket, one hand curled around the inhaler Isaiah had placed beside her pillow. He sat on the edge of his bed and listened to her breathing. Slow, even, clear. Only then did he stand. Isaiah had learned to measure safety in small things. A quiet breath, a locked door, a lunch packed before school, a child waking without fear. He filled the electric kettle in the shared kitchen and made oatmeal with cinnamon because Grace liked to pretend it tasted like apple pie. There were no apples that morning, but he sliced the last banana into 2 bowls and moved most of it into hers. When Grace entered 20 minutes later, her hair untamed and her eyes still heavy with sleep, she noticed immediately. "You gave me more again," she said. "Growing kids need fuel. So do grown-ups. Grown-ups run on coffee and stubbornness." She smiled despite herself. That smile was the reason he made jokes when he was tired. The reason he kept his shoulders straight when the shelter staff handed him another form asking how long he had been without permanent housing. Isaiah braided Grace's hair at the small desk, working carefully through each section. He had not known how to braid when she was a baby. He had learned from library books, patient mothers at playgrounds, and several embarrassing attempts that Grace was too young to remember. Now his hands moved with quiet confidence. "Do I look all right?" she asked. Isaiah met her eyes in the cracked mirror. "You look ready." He checked her backpack twice. Homework folder. Lunch. Inhaler. Emergency contact card. The folded drawing she had made the night before was tucked between two notebooks, though he did not know she had brought it. When Grace reached for her coat, her gaze dropped to the silver chain visible above his shirt. "You forgot to hide it." Isaiah touched the compass and slipped it beneath the fabric. "Thank you. Why do you always wear it if you do not want anyone to see it?" He paused. Grace had asked before, but each year her questions carried more weight. "Because it belonged to someone who trusted me with the most important thing in his life." "What thing?" Isaiah looked at her serious brown eyes, the same eyes that searched his whenever she sensed he was choosing his words. "A promise." She accepted that for the moment, though not completely. Grace rarely forgot an unanswered question. They left the shelter at 7:15 and walked 3 blocks toward the bus stop. The November air was sharp enough to sting their cheeks. Halfway there, an older man sitting outside a closed laundromat suddenly slumped sideways on the bench. Isaiah moved before anyone else reacted. He checked the man's breathing, loosened his collar, and asked a nearby woman to call emergency services. His voice became calm and precise, shaped by training he had not used professionally in years. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man was awake and speaking. One of the paramedics studied Isaiah with recognition, but Isaiah turned away before the question could come. Grace watched him as they continued walking. "You knew exactly what to do." "I used to do that kind of work. Before we lived here. Before a lot of things." At the bus stop, Isaiah noticed the black sport utility vehicle parked across the street. Its windows were tinted, its engine running. He had seen the same vehicle near Grace's school 2 days earlier and outside the shelter the previous night. He did not stare. He simply moved Grace to the inside of the bench and positioned himself between her and the street. "Are we in trouble?" she asked softly. Isaiah adjusted the strap of her backpack. "Paying attention is how we stay out of trouble." The bus arrived, and the vehicle pulled away without signaling. Later, after dropping Grace at school, Isaiah repaired a heating unit at a church pantry, fixed a broken lamp for an elderly woman at the shelter, and helped another father complete an online job application. No one there knew why a man with steady hands, medical knowledge, and careful speech had no address of his own. Isaiah preferred it that way. Just before evening, Grace asked if they had a home. He knelt to zip her coat. "A home is where someone keeps choosing you," he said. "An address is only where the mail goes." She slipped her hand into his, and together they walked toward the subway, unaware that before the night ended, the compass beneath his shirt would force 10 years of silence into the light. Victoria Ashford did not return to the memorial hall after the police took Isaiah and Grace away for questioning. She went home alone, sitting in the back of the town car, while rain traced thin lines across the windows and the city passed in blurred reflections of traffic lights. Her driver asked whether she wanted him to call Charles Whitaker. Victoria said no. For 10 years, Charles had been the first person she called whenever Ethan's name became too painful to carry by herself. That night, for the first time, she wondered whether the comfort he had offered had been built on truth or on silence arranged to look like mercy. The penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of Ashford Tower, but when Victoria stepped inside, the rooms felt strangely small. The staff had gone home. Her heels echoed across the marble entryway. On the wall opposite the elevator hung a formal portrait of Ethan at 28, dressed in a navy suit, one hand in his pocket, the silver compass resting against his white shirt. Victoria stopped beneath it. She had approved the portrait because it made him look like the future of Ashford Biomedical. Ethan had disliked it because, as he once told her, it made him look like a man who had never waited beside a frightened patient in a crowded public clinic. At the time, Victoria had called him ungrateful. Now she stared at the painted expression and realized the portrait showed the son she wanted the world to see, not necessarily the man Ethan had become. His old bedroom remained at the end of the west hallway. Victoria had kept it locked since the funeral. Charles once suggested turning it into a private office, but she could never allow anyone to move Ethan's books. She entered the security code with fingers that hesitated over the final number. The door opened with a quiet click. Dust softened the edges of the furniture. Medical textbooks leaned unevenly across the shelves. A pair of running shoes still rested beneath the window. On the desk stood a framed photograph of Victoria and Ethan at his medical school graduation. She remembered the pride she had felt that day and the argument that followed less than 3 hours later, when Ethan announced he would work at St. Matthew's Community Clinic instead of joining the company. "You built a future for me without asking whether I wanted to live in it," he had said. Victoria had answered that only privileged people could afford to reject opportunity. Ethan had looked at her with a sadness she mistook for disrespect. She opened the desk drawers one by one. Most held ordinary things: old receipts, pins, hospital identification cards, and folded notes from patients. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of company reports, she found a photograph torn neatly down the middle. Ethan stood outside a brick clinic, smiling in a way he never smiled for corporate cameras. One arm extended towards someone who had been removed from the picture. Only the edge of a woman's pale green sleeve remained. On the back, Ethan had written, "She reminds me that people are not problems to be solved." Victoria read the sentence twice. She had never heard of the woman. Beneath the photograph was a receipt from a pediatric supply store dated 11 months before Ethan died. The purchase included infant blankets, feeding bottles, and a small silver music box. Victoria felt a cold uncertainty settle inside her chest. Ethan had no children. At least, that was what she had always believed. Her phone rang. Charles's name appeared on the screen. She let it ring 3 times before answering. "Victoria, the police have the man," he said. "Legal is already involved. We should keep this simple. He stole from the scene, and now he is using a child to make himself look sympathetic. How did he know Ethan was alive after the crash?" Silence lasted less than a second, but Victoria heard it. "He is lying." The report said Ethan died on impact. That was the official medical conclusion. Whose conclusion? Charles exhaled slowly. "You are upset. Do not let a stranger reopen wounds he knows nothing about." Victoria looked around Ethan's room. Did Ethan ever mention a woman from St. Matthew's? No, the answer came too quickly. Victoria moved to the bookshelf and noticed one medical journal pushed farther back than the others. Behind it was a narrow black notebook. Most of the pages contained patient observations and notes about equipment failures. Near the end, one sentence had been underlined twice. "Mom protects the company because she thinks it protects the family. She does not see who the company is protecting from her." Victoria's grip tightened. On the next page, written in darker ink, were 7 words that made her stop hearing Charles entirely. "If something happens to me, find the man who stayed." Beneath the sentence, Ethan had drawn a small compass. Victoria ended the call without explanation. She turned toward the portrait and understood that Isaiah had not been the first person to suggest her world was hiding the truth. Her son had tried to warn her before he died, and she had never even opened the notebook. Detective Hannah Brooks had interviewed people who lied with anger, people who lied with charm, and people who buried the truth beneath so many details that no one could find it again. Isaiah Reed did none of those things. He sat across from her in the interview room with both hands resting on the metal table, his damp shirt slowly drying beneath the fluorescent lights, his expression calm enough to be mistaken for indifference. Grace waited in a family services office down the hall with a female officer and a cup of hot chocolate she had not touched. Isaiah had asked twice whether she could see him from where she was sitting. Hannah had told him she was safe. It was the only answer he seemed to care about. Charles Whitaker stood near the door with an attorney from Ashford Biomedical, speaking as though the police station were another boardroom he expected to control. "The facts are straightforward," Charles said. "Mr. Reed has no permanent address, no current full-time employment, and no credible explanation for possessing property that belonged to a deceased man." Isaiah looked at him for the first time. "I gave an explanation." Charles adjusted the cuff of his coat. "You made a claim you seem very eager to dismiss." Hannah raised one hand before Charles could respond. "Mr. Whitaker, this is my interview." Charles gave her a tight smile and stepped back. Victoria sat in the corner with Ethan's black notebook closed across her lap. She had arrived less than 10 minutes earlier and had said almost nothing. Isaiah noticed the notebook immediately. His gaze paused on it for one brief second, but Hannah saw the recognition. "You have seen that notebook before," she said. Isaiah looked at her. I have seen Ethan ride in one like it. Victoria leaned forward. Did Ethan give you the necklace? Yes. When? The night he died. Where? Isaiah remained silent. Charles let out a quiet breath of impatience. Every useful detail disappears the moment anyone asks him for proof. Hannah opened a folder. Let us try something else. You worked as an emergency medical technician until 10 years ago. That is correct. Your certification was suspended 6 months after Ethan Ashford's death. That is correct. You appealed twice and lost. That is correct. Since then, you have worked maintenance, warehouse, repair, and temporary construction jobs. You entered a family shelter with Grace 4 months ago. Isaiah's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. None of that explains how I got the necklace. It explains why someone might need money, Charles said. Isaiah turned toward him slowly. Being homeless did not make me a thief. The room fell silent. Victoria looked down at Ethan's notebook. Hannah studied Isaiah's face. Then help me understand. Why keep the necklace for 10 years? Because I made a promise. To Ethan? Yes. What did you promise him? Isaiah glanced toward the door. That answer involves my daughter. Charles stepped forward at once. Then the child is part of this investigation. Isaiah rose halfway from his chair before Hannah told him to sit. He obeyed, but the atmosphere in the room changed. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. Still, the quiet strength in him made Charles take one step back. You can search my bag, Isaiah said. You can review every job I lost and every shelter form with my name on it. You can call me poor. You can call me unstable. But you will not use Grace to force a lie out of me. Victoria lifted her eyes. No one is threatening your daughter. Isaiah looked directly at her. A family services worker asked whether she felt safe with me. Your attorney requested her birth records before anyone asked if she had eaten. Your security team separated us while she was crying. That is not concern. That is pressure. Victoria opened her mouth, but no answer came. Hannah turned a page in the file. Grace's amended birth certificate named Isaiah as her legal father. The original record remained sealed. Where is Grace's mother? She asked. Isaiah's. Expression softened. She died the same night Ethan died. Charles looked sharply at him. Victoria's fingers tightened around the notebook. Was she with Ethan? Hannah asked. Isaiah said nothing. Mr. Reed, what did Ethan say before he died? The question settled over the room. Isaiah stared at the table for several seconds, and Hannah thought he might refuse again. Then he looked toward the hallway where Grace was waiting. He did not ask me to save him, Isaiah said quietly. He asked me to save his daughter. For the first time that night, Victoria Ashford stopped looking at Isaiah as a suspect and began looking at him as the last person who had heard her son speak. Charles Whitaker did the opposite. That is impossible, he said quickly. Ethan did not have a daughter. Isaiah turned toward him. You sound very certain for a man who was not there. Detective Hannah Brooks closed the folder in front of her and leaned forward. Start at the beginning, Mr. Reed. Tell me what happened that night. Isaiah looked toward the hallway where Grace was waiting. He seemed to measure every word before allowing it into the room. I had just finished a 16-hour shift, he said. A storm had flooded part of the interstate, so traffic was being redirected onto County Road 9. About 11 miles outside the city, I saw fresh tire marks leaving the pavement. He described pulling onto the shoulder, calling emergency services, and taking the medical bag he kept in his trunk. The rain was heavy enough to hide the road below, but when Isaiah reached the slope, he saw 2 vehicles, not one. Ethan's sedan had stopped near a stand of bare trees. A smaller car rested farther down the embankment. Ethan was conscious when I reached him, Isaiah continued. Confused, but conscious. His left arm was injured, and he was struggling to breathe. Hannah opened the official report. The medical examiner's report placed the primary injury on Ethan's right side. Then the report was wrong. Charles shook his head. Or your memory is. Isaiah ignored him. Ethan had not asked whether help was coming. He had pointed toward the second vehicle and repeated the same words until Isaiah understood him. The baby. Check the baby. Inside the smaller car, Isaiah found Rebecca Lane, a nurse from St. Matthew's Community Clinic. He recognized her because emergency crews often brought patients to the clinic when they had nowhere else to go. An infant was secured in the rear seat, crying but breathing. Isaiah carried the baby away from the car and wrapped her in an emergency blanket. Was that child Grace? Hannah asked. Isaiah's face gave nothing away. I will not discuss her identity until I know she is legally protected. Charles stepped closer to the table. You do not get to withhold information involving the Ashford family. Isaiah's gaze dropped to Charles's right hand. A gold ring rested there, marked with the old Ashford biomedical seal the company had stopped using years earlier. You were wearing that ring that night, Isaiah said. Charles went still. Victoria looked at his hand. What is he talking about? Nothing, Charles replied. Isaiah continued. Near the top of the slope, a black sport utility vehicle had been parked with its lights off. A man stood beside it for less than a minute, watching the scene from the road. Isaiah called to him for help, but the man turned away and drove off. The darkness had hidden his face. The ring had not. Many senior executives received those rings, Charles said, including Ethan. Ethan was beside me. Hannah wrote something in her notes. Did you report this 10 years ago? Yes. It is not in the official file. Neither is the second vehicle. Victoria looked down at Ethan's notebook. What was in his car? She asked. Isaiah hesitated. A blue document bag. Ethan kept asking whether I had seen it. Charles's posture tightened. What documents? He did not have enough time to explain. Charles gave a cold laugh. This is a story built around details no one can verify. Isaiah leaned back. Then explain why an Ashford biomedical attorney came to my apartment 3 days after the funeral and offered me $50,000 to change my statement. Victoria's face lost its color. Charles said nothing. Hannah's pen stopped moving. Isaiah reached beneath his shirt, removed the silver compass, and placed it carefully on the table. Ethan gave me this after I brought the baby close enough for him to see her. Victoria touched the words engraved on the back. Always find your way home. What did he say? She asked. Isaiah looked at her with tired, steady eyes. He said the compass would help prove who the child's parents were when it was finally safe to reveal the truth. Before Victoria could ask another question, the interview room door opened. A uniformed officer spoke quietly to Hannah. Grace had begun coughing in the family services office, and her inhaler was not helping. Isaiah was on his feet at once. Take me to her. Hannah led him into the hallway, with Victoria following several steps behind. Grace sat pale and frightened beneath the bright office lights while a paramedic prepared to take her to the hospital. Isaiah knelt in front of her and spoke softly until her breathing began to steady. At the hospital, routine blood work revealed a rare inherited enzyme deficiency. The physician explained that it sometimes appeared in close relatives and asked whether Grace had any known family history. Victoria had heard the medical term only once before, when Ethan was tested as a child. She looked through the glass at Grace holding Isaiah's hand and understood that the girl in the hallway might not simply be connected to her son's final night. She might be the reason he had been trying to get home. Victoria remained outside Grace's hospital room while the physician explained that the enzyme deficiency was not proof of a family connection. It was only a clue, rare enough to justify further testing, but not strong enough to answer the question that had already changed the air between them. Isaiah stood beside Grace's bed, one hand resting over hers while the monitor near the wall kept a steady rhythm. She was breathing normally again, though exhaustion had softened her voice. Are we going home tonight? She asked. Isaiah looked at her carefully. We are going somewhere safe. Grace accepted the answer because she trusted him, but Victoria heard what he did not say. The shelter no longer felt safe. The black sport utility vehicle Isaiah had seen was still unexplained. Charles Whitaker was still making calls. And now that Grace might be connected to Ethan, powerful people would no longer overlook her. When Grace fell asleep, Victoria entered the room and closed the door behind her. Hannah Brooks remained near the window, giving them privacy without leaving. How long have you known who she is? Victoria asked. Since the night she was born, Isaiah said. You let me believe Ethan died without a child. Ethan believed there were people around you who would never let the truth reach you. Victoria's expression tightened. You did not know me. I knew what happened when I tried to contact you. Isaiah explained that 3 days after the funeral, he called Ashford Tower and asked to speak directly with Victoria. The first call was transferred to Charles's office. The second ended with an attorney warning him not to contact the family again. A week later, the same attorney appeared at Isaiah's apartment and offered him $50,000 to revise his statement. Isaiah refused. 2 days after that, Family Services received the first anonymous complaint questioning whether he had any legal right to care for Grace. Victoria looked toward the sleeping child. Why would Ethan trust you with her? Isaiah's eyes moved to the silver compass resting on the table beside Grace's inhaler. His voice became quieter. He told Victoria that Rebecca Lane had still been conscious when he reached the second car. She knew him from St. Matthew's because he had transported patients there many times. Grace had been only a few weeks old. Rebecca called the baby by name and asked Isaiah to bring her close enough for Ethan to see. Ethan touched one finger to the child's cheek and smiled despite the fear in his face. "My little compass," he whispered. Isaiah had not understood the meaning until Ethan removed the necklace and pressed it into his hand. "Do not let them turn her into an inheritance," Ethan told him. "Let her become a person before she becomes an Ashford." Rebecca asked Isaiah to promise that Grace would not be handed to anyone connected to the company until the truth was safe. Isaiah promised because two frightened parents were asking him to protect the one thing they still had a chance to save. "I thought I would keep her for a few days," he said. "Then a few weeks. Long enough for the investigation to become honest." It never did. The second vehicle disappeared from the official record. The blue document bag was never logged into evidence. Isaiah's statement was shortened until it no longer mentioned the man with the ring. By the time he realized someone was rewriting the entire night, Grace had already begun reaching for him whenever she was afraid. "So you adopted her," Victoria said. "I became her legal father." "Without telling me." Isaiah looked at her steadily. "I tried to tell you. The people around you made sure I never got close enough." Hannah's phone vibrated. She stepped into the hallway, then returned holding a photograph sent by a former records clerk from St. Matthew's. It showed Ethan sitting in a clinic chair with Rebecca beside him and a baby in his arms. The silver compass rested against the infant's blanket. On the back, Ethan had written 3 words, "My little compass." Victoria sat down slowly. The truth was no longer an accusation from a homeless man. It was written in her son's hand. Her grief turned, not into relief, but into anger. "You should have fought harder to reach me." Isaiah's face remained calm, but the pain in it became visible. "You should ask why your son believed reaching you was dangerous." Before Victoria could answer, Charles entered with 2 attorneys and a county family services representative. He placed a folder on the table. "A temporary emergency placement petition has already been filed," he said. "Until the child's identity is verified, she should be removed from Mr. Reed's custody." Isaiah stepped between Charles and Grace's bed. "She is already with her father." Charles looked at Victoria. "This man has hidden an Ashford heir for nearly 10 years. Victoria stared at him, then at the old company ring on his hand. "Who authorized this?" she asked. "I did." Her voice became cold. "Withdraw it." Charles hesitated only once. "You are emotional." Victoria stood. "No, Charles. For the first time in 10 years, I am paying attention." Charles did not withdraw the petition. 20 minutes later, a county attorney informed the hospital that a judge had approved a temporary emergency placement order based on Isaiah's lack of permanent housing, his suspended medical certification, and allegations that he had concealed Grace's biological identity. Victoria read the first page twice before looking at Charles. "You prepared this before you entered the room." He did not deny it. "I acted before emotion could compromise the family's interests." Isaiah stood beside Grace's bed, his face still, though every muscle in his body seemed to tighten. "She is not an interest," he said. "She is a child." The family services representative explained that the order did not determine permanent custody. Grace would remain in a licensed temporary home until an emergency hearing could review the new evidence. Her physician had documented that she no longer required hospital observation, which meant the transfer could legally happen that night. The words were calm and professional, but Grace understood enough to become frightened. "Dad, am I going somewhere without you?" Isaiah sat beside her and took both of her hands. He did not look at Charles. "For a little while." "Because we live at the shelter?" "No. Because I am related to Mrs. Ashford?" Grace glanced toward Victoria. Isaiah shook his head. "Because some adults are afraid of questions they cannot control." Charles objected, but Hannah Brooks placed a thick file on the table before he could continue. "Then let us discuss what was controlled," she said. Inside were Isaiah's employment records from 10 years earlier. He had earned 2 commendations as an emergency medical technician. Supervisors described him as disciplined, patient, and unusually calm during emergencies. 6 months after Ethan's death, anonymous complaints began appearing. One accused him of mishandling medication, though inventory records cleared him. Another claimed he abandoned a patient, though dispatch logs proved he remained on scene. None resulted in criminal charges, but together they created enough doubt for the licensing board to suspend him. Someone did not need to prove he was dangerous, Hannah said. They only needed to make every employer afraid to keep him. Isaiah explained what happened next without asking anyone to pity him. He sold his car to pay for an appeal. He worked nights in a warehouse and attended hearings during the day. When a maintenance company finally hired him, an anonymous caller warned the owner that Isaiah was under investigation for child endangerment. The claim was false, but he lost the job before Family Services closed the case. 2 years later, another report alleged that Grace had been left alone overnight. School records and a neighbor's statement proved she had been with Isaiah the entire time, yet the investigation remained open for 7 months. "Why did you not go to the press?" Victoria asked. "Because every headline would have put her face beside mine," Isaiah said. "I could survive being called a liar. She should not have to grow up being called evidence." He eventually found steady work maintaining 40 apartments and was allowed to live in a small basement unit with Grace. Then a legal challenge questioned whether her adoption records contained accurate information. Isaiah spent nearly everything he had defending his right to remain her father. The court upheld the adoption, but the property owner replaced him before the case ended. For months earlier, another rent increase forced him to move Grace into the shelter before an eviction could damage her school enrollment and housing record. Victoria stared at him. "You lost your career, your home, and your savings because you refused to change one statement." Isaiah looked at Charles. "I lost them because someone needed Ethan's last night to become simple." Charles closed the file. He had 10 years to come forward. "He did come forward," Victoria said. "You made sure no one heard him." Grace began crying when the representative returned with her coat. Isaiah knelt in front of her and zipped it slowly, just as he had that morning. "Listen to me," he said. "You did nothing wrong. Will you come get me?" "Yes." "Promise." Isaiah paused only long enough to make sure he was not offering comfort without meaning. "I promise I will not stop until you are home." Grace wrapped her arms around his neck. Isaiah held her without speaking, because anything more might have made her more afraid. When she was finally led into the hallway, she looked back 3 times. Isaiah remained standing until she disappeared around the corner. Only then did he lower his head. Charles gathered the papers with quiet satisfaction. "This could have been avoided if you had cooperated 10 years ago." Isaiah raised his eyes. "You mean if I had lied?" Hannah turned toward Charles. "What exactly did you ask him to change?" Charles said nothing. Victoria stepped closer to him. "You filed against a child before I even knew she existed. I protected the company and the family." "No," Victoria said. "You protected yourself from both." Hannah's phone rang. A former records clerk from St. Matthews had located an archived estate inventory connected to Ethan. One item had never been collected, a storage receipt sealed inside an envelope addressed to Victoria. The storage fees had been paid automatically for 10 years through Ethan's estate account. Attached to the receipt was a note containing 4 words in Ethan's handwriting. "Turn the compass backward." Charles's face changed before he could hide it. Victoria saw the fear and finally understood that whatever Ethan had left behind was the reason Isaiah's life had been dismantled piece by piece. She took the receipt from Hannah. "We find it tonight." Charles stepped toward her. "Whatever is in that unit could destroy Ashford Biomedical." Victoria looked at the empty hospital bed where Grace had been. "My son is dead. My granddaughter has been taken from the only father she knows. Do not speak to me as though the company is the thing here that needs saving." The storage facility stood 12 miles outside the city, beyond a row of repair shops and warehouses that had already gone dark for the night. Victoria's name appeared on the estate account connected to Ethan's unit, which gave her legal authority to open it. Hannah Brooks came with her to preserve the evidence, while Isaiah carried the silver compass beneath his coat. The manager verified the documents, unlocked the outer gate, and led them to Unit 217. Inside were 3 cardboard boxes, an old medical bag, and a narrow metal case marked with the same compass symbol Ethan had drawn in his notebook. Victoria opened the case and found a small video camera, a memory card, and a sealed envelope addressed to her. Beneath them was a note written in Ethan's hand. "Turn the compass backward." Isaiah removed the necklace and rotated the face counterclockwise. A hidden compartment opened with a faint click, revealing a tiny brass key. The key fit the lock on the metal case. Hannah inserted the memory card into a laptop at the manager's desk. The first recording showed Ethan sitting in a clinic office with Rebecca beside him and an infant sleeping against her shoulder. The silver compass rested against the baby's blanket. Ethan smiled down at her and said, "There is my little compass." Rebecca looked toward the camera. "Her name is Grace." Victoria pressed one hand against her mouth. The second recording showed Ethan alone. He explained that Ashford Biomedical had discovered a defect in one of its portable respiratory monitors. Under certain conditions, the device could display stable readings while a patient's breathing was becoming dangerously weak. Internal reports proved Charles Whitaker knew about the defect and delayed disclosure while the company prepared a quiet replacement program. "My mother does not know," Ethan said. "Charles keeps the risk reports away from her and calls it protection. He is not protecting the company. He is protecting himself." The next file had been recorded inside Ethan's car on the night he died. Rain covered the windshield. Rebecca held a blue document bag while headlights remained visible behind them through several turns. Ethan said they were driving to meet a federal investigator. Rebecca glanced toward the rear window. "That vehicle has followed us since the clinic." Ethan looked into the camera. "If anything happens to us, Charles knows about the defect, and he knows where we are going." The final file contained only audio. Ethan's breathing was strained, but his voice was unmistakable. Isaiah could be heard speaking to emergency dispatch and calming the baby. "Isaiah," Ethan said, "take the necklace." Isaiah's younger voice answered, "Save your strength. Listen to me. Grace cannot go to Charles. He will use her as leverage, and he will use my mother's grief to control both of them." There was a pause, followed by the faint sound of the chain being removed. "You stayed," Ethan continued. "Everyone else passed us, but you stayed. Keep her safe until my mother knows the truth. Tell her I wanted Grace to know her, but only when she was free to be a child." Victoria lowered her head as Ethan's final message continued. "Mom, if you hear this, Isaiah Reed did not take anything from me. I gave him the compass. I gave him my trust. He saved my daughter when I could not. Do not punish him for keeping the promise I asked him to keep." The recording ended, leaving only the hum of the laptop. Isaiah stood motionless. For 10 years, he had carried fragments of Ethan's final words. Now he had heard the entire truth. Hannah copied every file, documented the evidence, and contacted the district attorney. Victoria called an emergency meeting of the Ashford Biomedical Board. Charles joined by video from Ashford Tower, still believing he could control the room. Victoria played Ethan's recordings without introduction. When the final message ended, she placed the defect reports before the board. Effective immediately, Charles Whitaker is suspended from every position of authority, she said. All records will be preserved and delivered to state and federal investigators. An independent safety review begins tonight. Charles tried to interrupt. "Victoria, this will destroy the company." She looked directly into the camera. "Facing the truth is the only chance this company has to deserve survival." She ended the connection. Then she turned to Isaiah. "I cannot return what was taken from you. Tell me what justice requires." Isaiah did not ask for wealth. He asked that Ethan's name be cleared, every affected family be contacted honestly, his professional record be independently reviewed, and Grace never be treated as corporate property or an inheritance prize. Most of all, he asked that the temporary placement order be challenged immediately. Victoria signed an affidavit admitting that Charles had acted against her instructions and that Isaiah had protected Grace at Ethan's request. Hannah sent the recordings and supporting evidence to the family court. The judge scheduled an emergency review for the following morning and ordered that Grace remain in a licensed temporary home until the hearing. It was not the reunion Isaiah wanted, but it was the first honest decision the system had made in years. Before leaving the storage facility, he held the compass in his palm. For a decade, it had been the only proof that Ethan trusted him. Now the truth existed beyond his memory, beyond his word, and beyond the judgment of anyone who saw only a homeless black man. Victoria stood beside him and said quietly, "I believe the company protected my family." Isaiah closed his fingers around the compass. "Then tomorrow, protect the person your family left behind." The emergency hearing began shortly after 9 the next morning in a family courtroom on the 4th floor of the county courthouse. Isaiah sat beside a legal aid attorney, wearing the same dark shirt he had worn the night before, while the silver compass rested beneath his collar. Grace waited in a private room nearby with a child advocate until the judge decided whether she could return to him. Victoria sat behind Isaiah with Ethan's notebook in her lap. Charles Whitaker was absent. By then, investigators had secured his office, restricted his access to company records, and begun reviewing the complaints that had followed Isaiah for 10 years. None of that guaranteed Grace would come home. The judge had to decide what served the child's best interests, not who had the most money or the most powerful name. The county attorney summarized the reasons for the temporary placement. Isaiah had no permanent address. His professional certification had been suspended, and questions had been raised about Grace's original records. Isaiah's attorney answered with school attendance reports, medical records, shelter evaluations, and statements from teachers, pastors, neighbors, and former employers. Every document showed the same pattern. Grace had been educated, protected, cared for, and loved. Isaiah had attended every parent conference, managed every prescription, and never missed a medical appointment. The instability in their lives had followed the attacks against him, not neglect by him. Detective Hannah Brooks then presented Ethan's recordings and explained how important details from Isaiah's original statement had disappeared from the official file. When Ethan's final message played in the courtroom, Isaiah kept his eyes on the table. Victoria did not. She looked directly at the judge as her son's voice named Isaiah the man he trusted with Grace. The judge turned to her. "Mrs. Ashford, do you intend to seek custody or support the temporary placement?" Victoria stood. Her attorneys had advised her to request control over Grace's residence and inheritance. They said the Ashford name could offer security Isaiah never could. Victoria had listened, then dismissed them. "No, Your Honor," she said. "I intend to support the man who has already been her father." The courtroom became completely still. "You understand that you are Grace's biological grandmother?" the judge asked. "I do. And you are asking this court to return her to Mr. Reed?" "Yes." Victoria looked at Isaiah. "He did not keep my granddaughter from me. He kept her safe long enough for me to learn the truth. My company failed him. People I trusted damaged his career, his home, and his reputation because he refused to lie. I will not continue that harm by using wealth to take his daughter." The judge reviewed the evidence for several more minutes before calling Grace into the room. She entered wearing the yellow cardigan from her school picture and immediately searched for Isaiah. When she saw him, her shoulders relaxed. The judge spoke gently. "Grace, do you understand why everyone is here? They are deciding where I belong. Where do you believe you belong?" Grace looked at Victoria first. "She is my grandmother, and I want to know her." Then she turned toward Isaiah. "Ethan was my first father. He gave me my name. But Isaiah is the father who stayed. I belong with my dad." The judge upheld Isaiah's legal parentage, dissolved the temporary placement order, and returned Grace to his custody immediately. Isaiah agreed that Victoria could become part of Grace's life, but on Grace's terms and without using the courts to force it. When Grace crossed the courtroom, Isaiah knelt and held her as though the rest of the room no longer existed. Months later, Ashford Biomedical completed a national recall of the defective monitors, opened a compensation fund for affected families, and placed its safety program under independent oversight. Ethan's name was restored publicly as the doctor who had tried to protect patients. Isaiah's old disciplinary record was cleared after investigators confirmed that the complaints had been manipulated. He completed updated training and became eligible to renew his emergency medical certification, but he chose a different path. Through a separate restitution agreement with Ashford Biomedical, he created a neighborhood emergency response program that trained shelter residents, single parents, and community volunteers in basic life-saving care. Victoria offered him a senior corporate position. Isaiah declined. She offered him a penthouse. He declined that too. He accepted a modest 3-bedroom house near Grace's school because stability was not charity when it repaired damage the company had helped cause. Victoria began visiting on Sundays. At first, she arrived with expensive gifts. Grace thanked her, then asked whether they could bake cookies instead. Victoria burned the first batch. Grace laughed, and for once, Victoria laughed too. She learned to attend school concerts without bringing security, to listen without correcting, and to speak about Ethan as a son rather than an heir. One spring afternoon, the three of them visited Ethan and Rebecca's graves. Grace stood between the two headstones holding the silver compass. After a long silence, she placed it beneath Ethan's name. Isaiah waited. Victoria waited too. Then Grace picked it up again and walked back to Isaiah. It was his, she said. Yes. And he gave it to you. He did. Grace reached up and fastened the chain around Isaiah's neck. Then it belongs to the man who kept his promise. Isaiah touched the compass, unable to answer at first. Victoria stood beside them with tears in her eyes, but her grief no longer felt like a locked room. It had become a door she was finally willing to open. Isaiah took Grace's hand. Victoria walked on her other side. They left the cemetery together, not pretending the past had been repaired and not replacing anyone who had been lost. They simply chose, step by step, to become a family built on truth, dignity, forgiveness, and the quiet courage to stay.